All resources for this episode are provided in the show notes. You're listening to Dare to Think, the official podcast of MereLiberty.com. This episode is brought to you by Mere Liberty Courses, teaching youth and adults the principles of thinking well through a holistic approach to the Socratic method. For more information and to see what students are saying, visit courses.mereliberty.com. For nearly half a century, the abortion debate has been raging. It's a polarized topic that only seems to be getting worse. But what if both sides of the conventional abortion debate have it wrong? Millions of Americans feel caught in the middle. Rather than counting themselves as solidly left or right of this issue, most people lean one way or the other with a gut feeling that both sides are missing the point. But what exactly are they missing? 4 years ago, I began developing a third perspective on abortion. What if the problem with the conventional abortion debate is that both sides compromise on human rights? What if the resolution to the abortion debate is to not see human rights as a gray area and relative, but clear, unambiguous, and absolute? Most people perceive libertarianism to be fundamentally pro-choice on abortion by default. But there are many pro-life libertarians as well. And even so, libertarians tend to be split along the same lines as the conventional debate, rather than really exploring whether libertarianism offers a solidly third option. I hold that libertarianism offers a completely different perspective on abortion, one that recognizes the absolute human rights of both the woman and the unborn baby. In this episode, originally published on the Libertarian Christian podcast, I joined two other pro-life libertarian women to discuss the philosophy, science, and economics behind the abortion debate. Join me, Carrie Baldwin, with Jacqueline Otis Isaacs and Ruth Ryder as we dare to think about redefining the abortion debate.
I'm Larry Reed, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics.
Whoa. That person doesn't sound like he has a uterus. Let's start this thing over. Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Jacqueline Isaacs, and I'm guest hosting today instead of Doug because we're talking about abortion. Joining me today are two other ladies, Carrie Baldwin and Ruth Ryder. Carrie Baldwin is an independent researcher and writer with a bachelor's in philosophy from Arizona State University. Her writing focuses on libertarian philosophy and Reformed theology. She is a confessional Reformed, Orthodox Presbyterian in the tradition of J. Gresham Machen, an outspoken libertarian and defender of Christian orthodoxy. Ruth Ryder is an assistant editor of the Christian Libertarian Review, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. She's currently pursuing an accelerated nursing degree, but Ruth already holds master's degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and the University of Notre Dame. And I, Jacqueline Isaacs, am the Director of Strategy for Bellwether Communications. I'm the co-author of the book Called to Freedom, Why You Can Be Christian and Libertarian. To learn more about that project and to be notified about when the audiobook is available, go to calltofreedombook.com. All right, ladies, welcome to this episode. Which kind of leads us into the next pro-life myth, which is that a black market for abortions won't be created because back alley abortions were just a lie constructed by pro-abortion advocates, right? Why is it a myth that there won't be a black market for abortions?
Part of the reason why this myth exists is because prior to Roe v. Wade, you didn't really have a black market demand for abortion. I'm sure that you had people who were seeking it out, and you certainly had doctors who were performing it illegally. But the idea of back alley abortions with coat hangers, that is actually a myth, as it turns out. And there's a book, which I have not personally read myself, but I've read excerpts and I've heard other people talk about it. It is called Subverted, and it discusses how the sexual revolution hijacked the women's rights movement. But one of the things that they discuss in that book is this idea that back alley abortions and the threat to women's lives if abortion wasn't legalized was all a lie. It was all fabricated in order to drum up support for abortion. But the other side of this myth comes from, there was a study done in Chile on maternal mortality rates. And they studied the maternal mortality rate both before and after abortion was outlawed in Chile. And in the study, what they found was that there was a dramatic reduction in mortality rates, not due to outlawing abortion, but due to women's education level, delivery by skilled attendants, access to clean water, access to sanitary sewer systems, that sort of thing. But those are economic factors, not legal factors. And so what the pro-life people do with this study is they point out that the maternal mortality rate didn't increase after abortion was outlawed. And so they sort of take the results of that study out of its context, which is economic. And they say, look, back alley abortions were a lie. You didn't have women dying because of this. And Chile banned abortion, and you didn't have an increase in these maternal mortality rates. And so they sort of translate that to, there won't be a black market for abortions, but they don't understand how a black market occurs. So let me just explain how a black market works really quickly. So black markets occur when there's an economic demand for a product or service. And since that product or service isn't sanctioned by the government, the government withholds justice when aggression occurs. So on a white market, which is a legal market, there are channels sanctioned by the government to seek restitution or recompense for injustice. But on a black market, this doesn't happen because the government has withdrawn its administration of civil governance. And so violence is resorted to as a means of seeking recompense for injustice. So civil justice cannot exist on the black market, not because it's a market that avoids the government, but because the government, which has monopolized civil governance, avoids the black market. In fact, it can and does become the aggressor itself by participating in something called the red market, which is what you have with the drug war. So it's not unreasonable that in today's authoritarian climate, with the demand for abortion services and the demand for fetal tissue, that a black market will be created, and that a war on abortion from the conservative side would look a lot like the war on drugs, especially since so-called pro-life policy tends to be at the expense of women's self-ownership. So this pro-life myth that a black market won't get created comes from not understanding how economics works, how the demand factors in, and they don't understand the threat that does exist from having the authoritarian climate that we have right now. Now, libertarians know about, we're very aware of the authoritarian climate that we have, because we talk about it all the time. We talk about the fact that 40% of cops beat their wives. We talk about how strip searches for drugs are happening on the side of the road, even, women cops on female victims. We talk about no-knock raids happening on, wrong families, and children and pets are dying as a result. So we talk about these things all the time. And if we understand why that exists, why the drug war exists, why the black market for drugs exists, there's no good reason to ignore that when it comes to abortion and how enforcement of those laws would look. I think that pro-lifers so very much want to, save the lives of the unborn, and they don't believe that all of these negative things will happen. It's just a matter of getting that law in the books. But they do a disservice to their own cause, and they do a disservice to women by not understanding the economics. So pro-life libertarians should be out in front on this issue, especially when it comes to women's self-ownership and how to properly distinguish it on the abortion issue.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier when you first brought up the Chilean study that it's sort of a classic correlation does not equal causation fallacy.
Yeah.
That it just neatly fits the narrative that pro-lifers want to believe. But if that's not the truth about the world, if that's not reality, then it's not advancing our case.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So with your medical background, Ruth, and medical knowledge that you're bringing to the table here, I want to direct this next myth that there is never a compelling medical reason to terminate a pregnancy. So why is that a pro-life myth?
Well, apparently there are some pro-lifers who don't think that ectopic pregnancies are very dangerous. And that's because sometimes the ectopic pregnancy is in the woman's abdomen. So when that happens, there is a chance that the baby will survive. But most of the time it's in a fallopian tube, which has a much higher risk for the mother. So they get these two different types of ectopic pregnancies confused. And also some of them don't like to refer to the procedure of removing an ectopic pregnancy as an abortion, so they don't count that. It's just, they put that in a different class. But if we're being honest, with an ectopic pregnancy, we are terminating a pregnancy. The question then becomes, when is it ethically justifiable to terminate a pregnancy? And with an ectopic pregnancy, unfortunately, it is, if it's in a fallopian tube, because if it doesn't miscarry on its own, she's going to need to undergo a procedure or take a medication called methotrexate, which is actually a chemotherapy drug, to cause the death of the embryo or to remove it in order that she won't hemorrhage. And it's basically a question of, are we going to have one person die or two people die? And so in this case, of course, it makes more sense to spare the life of the mother, because we don't need two people dying, because we're pro-life.
Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of a classic triage mentality too, right?
Yeah, I would say that it is. You have to prioritize things in triage. Like if someone doesn't have a chance at all of survival, you're not going to prioritize their care. And with an ectopic pregnancy, if it's in the fallopian tube, it's never going to be viable, but it does have a risk the further it's allowed to progress of causing the woman to die. But at the same time, in other life-threatening pregnancies, when the baby is much bigger, and when we have conditions such as preeclampsia or eclampsia, when the mother's blood pressure becomes extremely high and she has other conditions that go along with that, the baby is usually delivered early. And that's the goal. With most life-threatening pregnancies, you do terminate the pregnancy, but we have to remember that delivering the baby is another way of terminating that pregnancy. But there are other times when we might want to do even earlier delivery when a woman has a terminally ill baby. And this does happen sometimes when a baby has a condition such as anencephaly. Because with anencephaly, the baby is likely to die at some point in the womb and be stillborn. So some women or parents decide that they're going to deliver their baby a little earlier to give them a chance to bond with their baby while it's still alive. Mm-hmm. And while I'm not necessarily advocating early delivery, I don't think it's necessarily something that should be lumped together with elective abortion. It's something that needs to be decided on an individual basis between parents and not only their physicians, but also with the guidance of a perinatal hospice team, which I'll discuss a little bit later. When you're delivering a baby early who has a life-limiting condition, I think ethically it's a little more comparable to removing life support, especially if it's done after the period of viability when life-sustaining measures could be performed if that seemed advisable after the baby was born.
Yeah, that's definitely cases that I think pro-lifers tend not to think about. I mean, they are rare cases, but they're also what makes us sad and uncomfortable. And, we don't want to think about those sort of worst case scenarios, but they do happen. And having compassionate alternatives for the terminally ill babies and the women that carry them is definitely an important thing for pro-lifers to be thinking about. So turning to the pro-choice or pro-abortion myths, for you, Ruth, is that embryos are just a clump of cells.
Clumps of cells is grown in a lab, and I've never done this, but what I've read is that they need to be stimulated to grow and divide. They don't just do it on their own. They're not self-directing. They need to be guided by the person working in the lab to do what they want them to do. In contrast, there was a study in 2016 which showed that human embryos, from the moment that conception is completed, continue to develop in a laboratory environment, even past the stage where they would normally implant in the uterus. And this confirms that they are entirely self-directed, exercising what could be understood as a form of autonomy. So, unlike cells in a petri dish, the cells of the embryo are all oriented toward the same goal, and that is its own successful implantation, development, and flourishing.
Yeah. And this is also an important point when it comes to understanding the self-ownership of the fetus, which is an argument that I make. And that self-direction, that autonomy, is what's necessary in identifying what's known as the objective link. And that's what we use in libertarian philosophy to be able to say that somebody has self-ownership, is they have those biological processes are what's in charge. It's the direct and immediate control is under the power of the zygote at that moment rather than the mother. So the mother's control is indirect at that point, whereas the zygote's control is direct. And that's why we can say that, yes, there is a case to be made for fetal self-ownership and the rights from the completion of conception, which is when it becomes a zygote.
So once you can get a pro-choicer to say, okay, maybe it's not a clump of cells, maybe it does have biological functions like a heartbeat, sometimes you'll get the argument that even so, the fetus is a parasite if it's not wanted. Why is that a myth?
Well, I think that a lot of us have seen recently that there was this professor, I think it was a graduate level biology professor out in California, who made the argument that a fetus is literally a parasite or cancer. And I've also heard this from people who should know better. Meanwhile, the field of biology has recognized that this is a phenomenon known as reproduction, which is a biologically desirable state for living organisms. The ability to reproduce is also one of the criteria for determining that some things are alive, like trees, and that others are not, such as rocks. The process of reproduction is also so biologically desirable that our bodies are wired to achieve that goal since the time we're in the womb. For example, female fetuses have all of their eggs in their ovaries by about 15 weeks gestation. It's also why we have sex organs that respond to sex hormones and which give women the chance to become pregnant every month. It's obvious to me that the biological favorability of reproduction is why a woman's body prepares to continue to feed the baby after it's born through lactation. We don't do this when we have parasites. We don't plan for when they leave because they're never going to leave. We're in a pathological state. We need to get rid of them. Also, when women do become pregnant, their bodies don't launch an immunological attack against the embryo as if it were a protozoan. They accommodate the pregnancy by lowering their immune response, and this is called maternal fetal tolerance. And this actually begins even before implantation occurs. Now, this is interesting to me because most people are unaware that the mother's body knows that conception has occurred, and that they think that it only knows that it's pregnant once the implanted embryo begins secreting HCG, which is what gives you a positive pregnancy test. But even before implantation, the embryo, which is called a morula or blastocyst at this stage, has begun secreting a chemical called early pregnancy factor, and it can be detected about 48 hours after conception in the mother's blood. And what it does is it tells her body to adjust its immune response in preparation for implantation so that it doesn't try to reject it. In contrast, for example, if the mother were to get an organ transplant, she might need immunosuppressive therapy for the rest of her life to prevent her body from rejecting it. But a pregnant woman doesn't need this because her body has suppressed it all on its own. And it seems that, we could say that the mother's body has essentially given the embryo an engraved invitation. This is far from it being a parasite.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Dare to Think. My mission with this podcast is to challenge and rethink our paradigms for politics, religion, and culture. My goal is to bring you high-quality content that encourages you to do the same. I provide a ton of free content, but it's only possible by those who've joined my efforts by becoming monthly members. Monthly members get exclusive rewards, including access to a members-only forum, discounts on any of my web courses, and live quarterly Q&As. For a limited time, I'm also giving away a free signed copy of the new book I co-authored with the guys from the Libertarian Christian Institute called Faith-Seeking Freedom: Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. You don't want to miss this. You can join for as little as $4 a month. This allows me to produce this content full-time. For more information and to join, visit mereliberty.com/membership. Now let's get back to the episode.
A pro-choicer might say if it's not a parasite, it is still a trespasser if it's not wanted, if the pregnancy wasn't planned, if it came about in certain sets of circumstances, the fetus is a trespasser, and that still is a reason for abortions. But Carrie, why is that a myth?
Right. So this is the one that you're going to hear in libertarian circles. It was made popular by Murray Rothbard, who also incidentally tried to call the fetus a parasite as well, although he seems to be using it in a pejorative sense. But in any case, it was first started by Murray Rothbard and then expanded upon by Dr. Walter Block, who has been, he's basically taken this position for the past 42 years. And this comes from a perspective that, we're going to go ahead and concede the possibility that this is a new life and that it does have rights, but the fetus doesn't have a right to be in the woman's body. And so this is Dr. Block's position. He acknowledges that this is a new, unique living human and that it has rights, basic rights to life. But there's a rights violation that he would claim that the fetus is actually trespassing the mother's womb. So a trespasser is just someone who enters a piece of property without permission. And of course, self-ownership is the idea that we own ourselves. And so the woman's body is the woman's property. So I argue that a fetus, one, doesn't actually enter the property of the woman. Rather, it's a product of combined human action, which emerges within the woman. So, it can't trespass if its point of origin is from within the place that we're alleging it trespasses. But two, I argue that the fetus doesn't actually need permission to be there in cases of voluntary sexual intercourse, whether pregnancy was the intended goal or not. If the act of sexual intercourse was voluntary, then the fetus doesn't need any particular permission to be in the mother's uterus, because we all know that even though it's not guaranteed, there are times when it doesn't work. We know that one possible outcome of having sex is getting pregnant. And we are certainly free to choose, but we're not free from the consequences of our choices. Now, in the case of rape, where the woman's involvement is involuntary, a positive right is not created against her, but it is created against the rapist. And the parental rights claim of the rapist as quote unquote father is negated by his act of aggression in creating the offspring. So basically, since his very first action as quote unquote father is one of violence, it constitutes child abuse, and therefore the only objective link left is the offspring's claim of restitution against the rapist. But this doesn't mean that a woman can respond to the fetus's presence in her body as though it's a trespasser. In libertarian legal theory, we also have the non-aggression principle, and the non-aggression principle certainly allows us to use self-defense. And, that's the idea here, is that if the fetus is a trespasser, then the woman can use self-defense by evicting it. But abortion is not a proportional response. So Dr. Block's idea with the trespasser and evicting the trespasser, the fetus in this case, evictionism says that a woman has a right to evict at any stage of the pregnancy, but in the gentlest manner possible. So Block and I would agree that after the point of viability, the mother is responsible for finding a suitable life support environment for her fetus if she wants to, essentially have an early delivery. She would be obligated to, find somebody to actually provide life support for that fetus, be it an adoptive family or, if technology has advanced, an artificial womb, something of that nature. Mm-hmm. But Block's argument is that eviction prior to viability necessitates killing, which is abortion, because there's no other way to evict. So he's saying that if her right to evict the trespasser doesn't avoid killing it, then that's what we're left with. So this actually doesn't seem to be in line with the proportional response of self-defense, which says that you cannot use more than what is necessary to stop the aggression without actually becoming an aggressor yourself. So if killing is your only option in a non-life-threatening situation, so we mentioned earlier that in cases where a woman's life is threatened, that's a completely different scenario. But if killing is your only option in a non-life-threatening situation, that actually necessitates a non-lethal response. But it also incentivizes the market to innovate, making viability earlier. And this is one of Dr. Block's goals. He's hoping that viability ends up going all the way to conception, or as close to conception as possible, so that women do have the greatest choice possible when it comes to unwanted pregnancies, and that choice is life affirming.
Okay, so if we can get all the way to the point that you're talking with a pro-choice person, oftentimes you'll still get the response that there are lots of medical reasons to terminate a pregnancy. And we need to consider all of these overwhelming volume of cases where there's medical reasons to terminate the pregnancy. So Ruth, since this is a medical question, let's go back to you. Why is this a myth that there are lots of medical reasons to terminate pregnancies?
Okay, so if you recall my discussion earlier about ectopic pregnancies and other life-threatening pregnancies, an ectopic pregnancy is a justifiable medical reason to terminate a pregnancy. But in any other case, the goal is to deliver the baby and to take care of both, to provide the best care possible to both. So you want to prolong the pregnancy as long as possible to give the baby the best chance. And then when it's necessary, deliver the baby care for them both. Unfortunately, there is also a lot of confusion among even physicians, or perhaps it's not confusion. Maybe that's a little too charitable. I'm not sure. But there does seem to be a lot of concern with liability. And so a lot of times you will have abortion recommended as being necessary due to the mother's health. But in reality, it's not. It's more due to the physician's own concerns in case anything at all were to go wrong. And there's a possibility that they could be sued. They are better off legally if they recommend abortion, because there's this legal concept of a wrongful birth, but there is no concept of a wrongful abortion. This doesn't exist. It's not something doctors worry about. I read an article by Dr. Thomas Murphy Goodwin, who's the chief of maternal fetal medicine at the University of Southern California, who wrote about this issue of liability. He said, for many physicians, it translates into simply recommending every possible test and erring on the side of suggesting abortion whenever there's a question of risk to the mother or child. And that there's this tremendous imbalance between the liability in not informing the mother of risks compared to the liability of suggesting the alternative of abortion. And I've actually experienced this a little bit, even with my own current pregnancy. As you know, I'm currently, at the time of recording, 25 weeks pregnant with my second child. And this pregnancy started off a little unusual. I had several ultrasounds early on because I've had a couple of miscarriages. And at one of those early ultrasounds, my doctor said she thought it looked like I might have a really rare form of ectopic pregnancy called an interstitial pregnancy. And an interstitial pregnancy is technically in the fallopian tube, but it's right inside the part of the fallopian tube as it's passing through the wall of the uterus. So on an ultrasound, it looks like it's in the uterus, but it's not. And if it's not caught, then at about 12 weeks, it can cause not only the fallopian tube, but also the uterus to rupture, which leads to massive hemorrhage. So a couple of times, my OB had asked me if this was a pregnancy that was important to me, implying that if not, then I could just not take the risk of having my uterus rupture and get the injection of methotrexate that would terminate the pregnancy. However, when I found out what she thought it was, I started doing as much research as I could on the topic, and I found out that this can't really be definitively diagnosed without an MRI or a laparoscopic surgery. So at my appointment, when she asked again if this was a pregnancy that was important to me, I told her yes, and I know that I need an MRI in order to find out for sure what's going on, because I'm not going to make any decision unless I know for sure that that is something that I have to do. So I got the MRI, which showed that everything was normal. It was inside my uterus. It was totally fine. So had I just listened to her and not done my research and taken the methotrexate, that would have ended my baby's life unnecessarily. And this is likely because she was concerned about the liability of me hemorrhaging to death because she didn't catch this interstitial pregnancy. And then this leads me to another interesting point. I wrote an article recently that was posted at LCI and at FEE about women using cannabis to treat hyperemesis gravidarum. In hyperemesis gravidarum, this is severe morning sickness where these women can't even keep down water. And so they become severely dehydrated and malnourished. And in some cases, it's so bad that either doctors are recommending abortion, even though that's not standard treatment, or women are seeking it out themselves because they feel so desperate because they're not being taken seriously, or they're not being given the treatment that they need in order to function and not stay in the hospital getting IV fluid. So some of them are breaking the law to use cannabis because they found that it's the only thing that helps them deal with this hyperemesis and keep anything down for their own health and their babies. So this is just another example of an alleged medical reason for terminating a pregnancy that's really not justified at all. And the only reason it exists is because government is preventing women from having effective treatment.
Yeah. Well, and from an economic perspective, the market responds when there are needs. And these needs for medical innovation aren't coming to the surface, rising to the surface, because right now that's being answered with abortion. And we need the market to respond to these needs if we're going to have the medical advancements, if we're going to have the leaps and bounds in innovation and technology. We need to have those needs rise to the surface so that people in the market can answer that call.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but I do want to move us on towards, we've got one last myth here we want to address, and it's not entirely a myth. It's sort of a half-baked truth that's usually deployed as what we could call a myth. But that is that if we limit access to abortion with legislation like what's happening in some of these states we've mentioned, Georgia, Alabama, if we overturn Roe v. Wade, women will be prosecuted for pursuing abortions. They'll be suspected and scrutinized when they have miscarriages, and the world of The Handmaid's Tale will come true, and we're all going to live in this dystopian reality if we get rid of abortions. So, Carrie, why is that final myth a myth?
Well, this one's a tough one because it is not necessarily a myth. So The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian fiction novel that was written by Margaret Atwood. In fact, unironically, it was written in 1984 in post-World War II Berlin. That's where she was living at the time. And, it's a dystopian fiction along the same lines as George Orwell's 1984. And let's see, there's also Catch-22 and Fahrenheit 451. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of writing these dystopian fictions is not to say this will never happen. It's to send a warning that this could happen. Mm-hmm. Now, The Handmaid's Tale is not really about abortion. The real warning in this book is concerning, again, women's self-ownership, which is a relatively new concept in human history. It's concerning atrocities against women, which have been made under many flags, including religion, and Christians are not innocent of this. And there are many sects in Christianity today in America in well-respected denominations that have very low views of women. And quite frankly, if you don't see this, you're not paying attention. Now, Margaret Atwood correctly identifies what's at stake in the dystopia, which is women's rights, and more accurately, what we would call libertarian self-ownership. But self-ownership doesn't give women the right to abort. The real threat is authoritarianism. It's authoritarian-sanctioned, institutionalized violence against women, okay? Mm-hmm. So authoritarianism can come from any source of monopolized power. It can come from the state, it can come from the church, it can come from the family, it can come in business, it can come in education, it can come from a variety of places. And women have the most to lose from authoritarianism. Socialism, fascism, communism, any form of authoritarianism entails the exploitation of women. And we know from history that this has been done by non-religious governments like the Chinese, but it's also been done under the flag of religious governments like in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, or in, like I mentioned earlier, various Christian sects. But The Handmaid's Tale, so this is part of where the myth comes up. The Handmaid's Tale, like I said, is not about abortion. It's about institutionalized violence against women. And so you can actually have a Handmaid's Tale scenario with or without legal access to abortion.
Mm-hmm.
We have a tendency to conflate the legal access to abort as the correct response to violence against women. And I think that that's an error, because what that's saying is that the only response to sexual violence against women is to kill the offspring. And that doesn't actually address sexual violence against women. This is really a perfect time to bring up how rape would be handled in a libertarian society, because this goes hand in glove with how pro-life libertarians are different and differ from conservative pro-lifers. So in a libertarian legal order, we are operating from a perspective that rights are based in property rights rather than some sort of ethics-based argument. So more than likely, you're going to have a tort law sort of situation where victims of rights violations are seeking restitution and recompense. And this is usually in terms of being paid for, pain and suffering, lost wages, medical expenses, etc. Without legal abortion, or where we've just removed abortion as an option, when you have a pregnancy resulting from rape, that pain and suffering is increased, lost wages might be increased, medical expenses would definitely be increased. And you also have the cost of childcare and just raising that child, not just childcare, but the cost for food and shelter and clothes and education, and all of those things start to add up. If you have a legal option for abortion, then in these situations of restitution, the cost of that goes down. So you don't have the added expenses for the cost to raise a child, or the increased medical expenses, or the increased rates for pain and suffering, and so forth. So with legal abortion, the cost of rape actually goes down. Without legal abortion, the cost of rape goes up. So reducing the cost of the crime by violating the rights of an innocent human is not only not libertarian, it denies the woman justice for the crime against her, and it effectively lets the rapist off the hook for his crime. So a libertarian legal order would actually raise the salience of sexual violence against women to one of the most costly crimes an individual could commit. So real justice for rape means prohibiting abortion and making rapists pay for the full extent of their crime. And also in a tort law situation, they have found that there is a deterrent effect, which is not found with legislative law. So likely in a libertarian situation, you would have the incidence of rape go down just because it costs too much. Now, this certainly can't be guaranteed by the state or an authoritarian society. And actually, I was looking up some of the numbers for legal rape response in the country as it exists now. And it said that for every 50 rapes, only 10 actually get prosecuted. And of those 10, only, I believe it's 7 actually get convictions. So you have a vast majority of rape victims right now who are not getting justice for the sexual violence against them. And although I think that that's a multifaceted problem and you can't wholly reduce it to abortion, I do believe that part of the reason why women aren't getting the justice that they deserve for sexual violence against them is because abortion is so easy of an answer. And this also goes back to what we pointed out with that book, Subverted, because one of the things that is pointed out in that book is that the women's rights movement was motivated and driven by women. But the sexual revolution was motivated and driven by men. And it was men who were trying to persuade women to tack on abortion to women's rights. So I really, truly believe that the evidence shows that abortion exists to get men off the hook when they want to be irresponsible and when they want to initiate violence against women. And so we're actually losing justice by having abortion be legal.
And in this case, the violence isn't just rape. I mean, this is applicable in domestic violence situations, any situation where a man would pressure the woman to get an abortion to do away with the responsibilities of pregnancy and caring for a pregnant woman and a newborn would be sort of in this category.
Well, and rape and abuse happens more often in familiar, intimate relationships than they do between strangers. So, yeah, it does absolutely feed into that. So, the Handmaid's Tale scenario, we want to be careful to say that it's not a possible scenario because, we make jokes now that 1984 was not intended to be an instruction manual. We do have a situation of catch-22 when it comes to the military. We do have censorship that may not be book burning like in Fahrenheit 451, but we are talking about censorship on the internet now. So these scenarios aren't impossible. And we need to realize that. But also, it's not merely because abortion is being prohibited. Rather, it's because we're living under an authoritarian state who doesn't operate on the concept of self-ownership and which doesn't actually care one bit about women. That's why we need to be careful about the dystopia.
And I think that really is sort of the libertarian vision here as sort of a third way in the abortion debate, that we can work to protect and give more opportunity and freedom to unborn children, to allow them to lead flourishing lives, but also to affirm and uphold the rights of women and the value of women through this whole process. So to you ladies, thank you so much for your time, for contributing your expertise on these issues.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed dialoguing with both of you.
And to you, the listeners, we give this conversation over to you. Hopefully, this has equipped you and stimulated new thoughts and ideas and given you lots of other articles and books and ideas you want to go chase down and read more about.
You've been listening to Dare to Think, the official podcast of MereLiberty.com. This episode was created due to the generous support of my patrons and underwriters. I'm so very grateful to Bob, Patrick and Shannon, Dave and Nina, Jean, John, Tom, and my newest patron, Nathan, for helping me get this episode published. If you've enjoyed today's episode and would like to join me and my other patrons and underwriters in our effort, you can sign up at MereLiberty.com/membership. Joining on a monthly membership comes with exclusive rewards and premium content. Alternatively, you can choose a one-time donation. You'll find a direct link to the membership page in the description to this episode. You can listen to more episodes by subscribing on virtually any podcatcher, and you can read my articles on MereLiberty.com and the Libertarian Christian Institute, where I'm a regular contributor. You can follow me on social media like Facebook, Twitter, Minds, and Locals.